The Millionaire Mindset. Nobody teaches why you stay broke and how to build wealth fast. Somewhere inside you, there is a belief about money that you never chose, and that belief is quietly deciding your bank balance right now more than your salary ever will. Two people can earn the exact same income, work the exact same hours, and end up in completely different financial universes 10 years later. Not because one of them found a secret investment, but because one of them carried a different set of beliefs about what money actually is. This is the part nobody puts in a course because it cannot be sold as easily as a stock tip or a budgeting app. It lives underneath the surface, shaping every decision before you even realize a decision is being made. You can know every financial rule in existence and still stay broke because knowledge sitting on top of a broken belief system simply gets overridden every single time. The same way a perfectly good recipe fails when it is cooked on a stove that was never actually working correctly underneath. This is exactly why so many people can read every finance book available, follow every budgeting rule perfectly for a few weeks, and still find themselves back in the same familiar patterns months later. Not from lack of effort, but because the underlying belief driving the behavior was never actually addressed. In the next half hour, you are going to dig into the actual architecture of the millionaire mindset, the invisible operating system running behind every wealthy decision you have ever admired from a distance, and you are going to see exactly where your own operating system might be quietly working against you. The first thing to understand is that everyone carries a money script, a belief absorbed so early in life that it now feels like personal truth rather than something that was simply installed. Some people carry the belief that money is dangerous, that having too much of it invites judgment or loss, so they unconsciously sabotage their own progress the moment it gets close to a threshold that feels unsafe. Others carry the belief that money is scarce, that there is only so much to go around, so any dollar spent by someone else feels like a dollar stolen from their own future. These scripts were never chosen consciously. They were absorbed from a parent's face tightening at the mailbox, from a hushed argument about bills, from a single sentence repeated so often it stopped sounding like an opinion and started sounding like fact. The wealthy operate on a completely different script, one that treats money as a neutral tool, expandable, buildable, something to be directed rather than feared or hoarded. These scripts rarely announce themselves directly. They surface instead as gut reactions, a flash of guilt when spending on something purely enjoyable, a wave of anxiety at the mere thought of asking for a raise, a strange discomfort at the idea of a bank account genuinely growing beyond what feels familiar. Identifying your own script does not require years of therapy. It simply requires noticing which reaction repeats most often and asking honestly where that specific reaction was first learned, usually somewhere far earlier in life than the current financial decision it keeps quietly influencing. Modern life adds a new layer onto these old scripts that previous generations never had to navigate. Constant visual comparison through screens showing curated glimpses of other people's spending, vacations, and possessions, almost never their debt, their stress, or their actual financial reality. This creates a distorted sense of normal, quietly pressuring decisions that have nothing to do with genuine values and everything to do with an unconscious desire to match an image that was never the full picture to begin with. Recognizing this distortion for what it is, a highlight reel rather than a balance sheet, removes much of its quiet power over everyday financial choices. This leads directly into the deepest divide of all, scarcity thinking versus abundance thinking. And this divide shapes almost every financial decision that follows it. Scarcity thinking treats every opportunity as a threat to existing resources, whispering that spending on growth, education, or investment is reckless because the money might be needed later for safety. Abundance thinking treats resources as something that can be actively grown, viewing an investment in a skill or an opportunity not as a loss, but as a seed. This is not naive optimism, and it is not about ignoring real financial constraints. It is about which question runs automatically through the mind at the moment of decision. Scarcity asks, "What could I lose?" Abundance asks, "What could this become?" Neither question is inherently wrong to ask, but a mind that only ever asks the first one systematically avoids every opportunity capable of producing real growth, since growth almost always requires some initial exposure that scarcity thinking instinctively treats as unacceptable. The same $100 in the hands of these two mindsets produces two entirely different financial trajectories, one protecting a shrinking pile, the other quietly building a larger one. Scarcity thinking also tends to view other people's success as evidence of a shrinking pool available to everyone else, which quietly breeds resentment rather than inspiration. Abundance thinking looks at the exact same success story and treats it as proof of what remains possible, extracting lessons rather than comparison, which is precisely why people operating from abundance tend to build stronger, more collaborative networks than people quietly competing against everyone around them for a piece of an imaginary fixed pie. Abundance thinking also tends to come with a practical daily habit rarely discussed in financial content, a genuine practice of noticing what is already working rather than fixating exclusively on what is missing. This might sound disconnected from spreadsheets and investment accounts, but the two are more linked than they appear. A mind constantly scanning for lack tends to make decisions from urgency and fear, chasing quick fixes, reacting emotionally to market dips, abandoning solid long-term plans the moment short-term discomfort appears. A mind trained to notice sufficiency, even a modest one, tends to make calmer, more patient decisions, the exact temperament that long-term wealth building actually rewards. This is not about pretending problems do not exist. It is about training attention deliberately, so that fear is not the only lens available when a financial decision needs to be made. Beneath both of these patterns sits a distinction almost nobody names directly: the difference between an employee brain and an owner brain. An employee brain asks, "How many hours do I need to work to afford this?" An owner brain asks, "What can I build or acquire that will produce this income without requiring my hours at all?" This is not a judgment about having a job, since plenty of wealthy people hold jobs for years while building wealth on the side. It is about which question dominates the thinking. Someone trapped in employee brain sees a raise as the only lever available to improve their situation. Someone operating in owner brain sees a raise as one input among many, alongside investments, businesses, and assets that keep generating income long after the original effort has ended. The practical exercise worth trying here is simple: listing every current source of income on one side, then listing every possible asset or system that could eventually generate income without direct hourly effort on the other, even if that second list currently sits empty. The value is not in immediately filling that second list. It is in the simple act of acknowledging it exists at all, which alone begins shifting attention toward opportunities an employee brain would have overlooked entirely. This single shift in questioning, repeated for years, is often the real difference between someone who retires exhausted and someone who retires free. It is worth being precise here, because owner brain is not about titles or business cards. Plenty of employees think like owners, while plenty of business owners still think like employees, trapped inside their own company doing every task personally rather than building systems capable of running without them. The distinction lives entirely in the question repeated inside the mind at each decision point, not in whatever word happens to appear on a job description. This distinction also explains why so many capable people stay stuck for years inside careers that no longer serve them, trapped by a version of the sunk cost fallacy, believing the years already invested somehow obligate continuing down the exact same path. Owner brain recognizes that time already spent cannot be recovered regardless of the decision made today, and evaluates the path forward purely on its own merits, unclouded by loyalty to a past decision that a different, earlier version of the same person once made with far less information than is available right now. Comfort deserves an honest, uncomfortable examination here, because comfort is the quiet enemy hiding inside almost every stalled financial life. The job that pays enough to get by but never enough to build real momentum feels safe precisely because it requires nothing new. The familiar spending pattern, even one that keeps a person perpetually behind, feels safer than an unfamiliar one that might actually work. Comfort convinces the brain that stagnation is the same thing as safety, when in reality stagnation simply delays the discomfort, moving it further down the timeline where it eventually shows up disguised as regret. Wealth builders learn to treat discomfort as a signal of growth rather than danger, deliberately choosing the version of a decision that feels slightly uncomfortable today, because that discomfort is almost always the exact price of tomorrow's freedom. This does not mean discomfort for its own sake, chasing hardship as some kind of badge of honor. It means recognizing the specific, narrow discomfort that sits directly on the path toward a genuine goal, and choosing to walk through it deliberately, rather than mistaking the absence of that discomfort for actual progress. The job search that feels intimidating, the investment account opened for the first time, the honest budget review after months of avoidance. None of these feel pleasant in the moment, yet each one sits directly on the only path that actually leads somewhere different than where a person currently stands. Comfort, left unexamined, has a quiet talent for disguising itself as wisdom, whispering patience when what it actually means is avoidance. And learning to tell the difference between the two is one of the more valuable skills this entire mindset ultimately depends on. A simple, honest question tends to reveal which one is actually present in a given moment, asking whether waiting is genuinely gathering more information or simply postponing an action that already has enough information to begin, and being willing to answer that question truthfully even when the honest answer is uncomfortable to admit. This naturally connects to how risk itself gets defined, because most people have an incomplete picture of what actually counts as risky. Spending years in a job with no upward path, no growing skill set, and no ownership stake feels safe on the surface. Yet it quietly guarantees a ceiling on lifetime income. Meanwhile, investing consistently in a diversified portfolio over decades feels frightening to someone who has never done it, even though history shows this path reliably builds wealth over time. The wealthy mindset redefines risk almost entirely, treating inaction and stagnation as the real danger, while treating calculated, informed action as simply the cost of building something larger than a single paycheck. It helps here to separate risk into two distinct categories: reversible and irreversible. Most financial risks worth taking, a modest investment, a new skill, a side project, fall firmly into the reversible category, meaning even a poor outcome leaves room to adjust, learn, and try again. Treating a reversible risk with the same caution reserved for a genuinely irreversible one, like an uninsured gamble with money needed for essentials, quietly wastes the exact caution that should have been reserved for decisions that actually deserve it. There is a trap hiding underneath all of this that deserves to be named directly: the quiet fusion of self-worth and net worth. Many people, without ever saying it out loud, measure their personal value by the number in their bank account, which creates a devastating trap the moment that number is low. Shame about a low balance leads to avoidance. Avoidance leads to ignored statements and unopened bills, and ignored problems compound quietly in the dark while nobody is watching them. Wealthy individuals learn, often through hard experience, to separate these two things entirely. A bad financial month is data, not a verdict on personal worth. This separation is not just emotionally healthier, it is strategically necessary, because a person consumed by shame cannot look clearly at their own numbers long enough to actually fix them. Ironically, the people most likely to genuinely build wealth over time are often the ones who can look at a disappointing bank statement with the same neutral curiosity they might apply to a business report, asking simply what happened and what adjustment comes next, rather than spiraling into a story about what the number says about them as a person. This same shame often extends into close relationships, where money becomes one of the last remaining taboo subjects, quietly avoided even between partners who openly discuss almost everything else. Wealth builders tend to break this silence deliberately, treating money conversations as a normal, recurring part of a healthy relationship rather than an emergency reserved only for crisis moments, which prevents small misalignments from quietly compounding into much larger conflicts years down the line. A short, regular check-in about finances, held with the same casual routine as any other household conversation, does more to protect a shared financial future than any single dramatic conversation held only after a crisis has already forced the issue into the open, usually at the exact moment when calm, rational discussion has become hardest to have. One of the most common excuses keeping people financially stuck is the belief that building wealth requires already having money. A belief so persistent it feels like common sense rather than the myth it actually is. This excuse feels protective because it removes any responsibility to start now, quietly promising that action will begin later, once conditions finally feel right. But conditions rarely announce themselves as ready. Nearly every wealth-building strategy that compounds meaningfully over decades, from index investing to skill development, works with small, consistent amounts far more reliably than it works with a single large sum arriving all at once. it helps to remember that many wealth-building tools were specifically designed for people without large sums to begin with. Fractional investing, automatic small transfers, low-cost index funds, none of which existed to serve only the already wealthy. The barrier standing in the way was rarely the amount of money required. It was the decision to begin before feeling fully ready, a feeling that, for almost everyone, never actually arrives on its own. A useful reframe here is imagining advice given to a close friend in the exact same situation, since most people can immediately see a reasonable starting point for someone else's modest income, even while insisting their own situation is somehow uniquely too small or too complicated to begin with anything at all. Failure occupies a completely different role inside the wealthy mindset than it does inside the mindset that keeps people stuck. Most people treat failure as a verdict, a final judgment confirming that a path was wrong and should never be attempted again. Wealth builders treat failure as data, a single data point revealing what did not work under specific conditions, nothing more permanent than that. This reframe changes everything about how a person approaches new ventures, investments, or skills, because a person who fears failure as identity destruction will avoid every risk capable of producing real growth. A person who treats failure as information moves forward faster, gathers more data points, and arrives at working solutions sooner, simply because each stumble gets processed and released rather than carried forward as evidence of permanent inadequacy. This is not a small psychological nuance, it compounds directly into financial outcomes, because every person who eventually built something significant, an investment portfolio, a business, a career, moved through a string of smaller failures along the way that simply never got the chance to end the story, because they were never treated as an ending in the first place. This is closely tied to another myth worth dismantling directly, the overnight millionaire story so often told in headlines and interviews, stripped of every unglamorous year that actually preceded the visible breakthrough. Nearly every dramatic success story, examined honestly, reveals a much longer, quieter timeline hiding just outside the frame, years of unnoticed effort, failed early attempts, and slow skill building that simply never made it into the highlight reel. Believing the compressed, dramatic version of these stories sets an impossible, discouraging standard, making ordinary, unglamorous progress feel like failure by comparison, when in reality that unglamorous progress is almost always exactly what real wealth building actually looks like while it is happening. A more accurate mental model treats every visible success as an iceberg, with the small, celebrated tip representing years of invisible effort sitting quietly beneath the surface, effort that rarely gets photographed, mentioned, or included in the story anyone actually hears. Perhaps the single most powerful shift inside the entire wealthy mindset is what can be called the compounding mindset, the ability to genuinely value outcomes that take years to materialize. Most financial decisions in daily life get evaluated on an immediate timescale. Does this feel good now? Does this solve today's problem? Wealth compounds on an entirely different timescale, often invisible for years before becoming undeniable. Learning to genuinely value a decision whose payoff will not arrive for a decade requires training the mind against its natural preference for immediate reward. This is why so many wealth-building habits look boring from the outside: automatic transfers into an investment account, modest living relative to income, patient reinvestment of returns. Boring, repeated consistently across enough years, quietly outperforms exciting, chased sporadically, almost every single time. This is precisely why so many financially successful people, when asked to describe their journey honestly, describe something closer to tedium than triumph, years of unremarkable consistency that simply never made for an exciting story, right up until the compounding finally became visible enough for everyone else to notice all at once. Beyond mindset alone, wealthy thinking consistently pushes toward building income that does not require continuous personal effort to sustain. This might mean a rental property generating monthly income, a small business eventually running with a trained team, dividends flowing from an investment portfolio, or a digital product sold long after the original creation work was finished. The employee brain sees only one income lever: hours worked. The owner brain sees dozens of potential levers, each one capable of running independently once properly built. This does not happen overnight, and every one of these income streams starts small, often unglamorous, sometimes barely profitable in the beginning. but each one represents a permanent shift away from trading finite hours for finite dollars, toward building assets that continue producing value while the builder sleeps, travels, or simply lives. The mindset shift required here is subtle but important, treating the first version of any income stream as a rough prototype rather than a finished product, expecting it to be clumsy and barely profitable at first, the same way any new skill looks awkward before it looks effortless, and allowing that early awkwardness to exist without treating it as proof the entire idea was flawed from the start. Behind every one of these income streams sits something equally important and rarely discussed: genuine clarity about why the income matters in the first place. A vague desire for more money rarely survives the inevitable difficulty of building something new, while a specific, vivid picture of what that income actually enables — time with family, freedom from a specific stressor, the ability to make choices without financial fear — tends to sustain effort through the exact moments when motivation alone would otherwise quietly fade. Environment shapes mindset far more than most people are willing to admit, because beliefs about money spread socially, almost like a contagious atmosphere absorbed simply by proximity. Spend enough time around people who treat debt as normal, savings as impossible, and risk as terrifying, and those beliefs quietly become your own defaults, regardless of what you privately believe you think. Spend time instead around people actively building, investing, and taking calculated action, and ambition starts to feel achievable rather than delusional, simply because it surrounds you as ordinary rather than exceptional. This is not about abandoning people who are struggling financially. It is about deliberately seeking additional relationships, communities, and mentors who model the specific behaviors and beliefs you are actively trying to build inside yourself. This can be as simple as following different voices online, joining a community focused on building rather than complaining, or finding a single mentor willing to answer questions honestly. Environment shapes mindset slowly and invisibly, the way water shapes stone, which means the change in influence rarely feels dramatic in the moment, yet produces a completely different person a few years down the line, simply through sustained, repeated exposure. Investing directly in a mentor or a coach, someone several steps further along a specific path, often feels indulgent or unnecessary to a mind still operating from scarcity, since the immediate cost is visible while the future benefit remains uncertain. Yet this exact investment routinely compresses years of trial and error into a fraction of the time, because a good mentor has already made and survived most of the expensive early mistakes a beginner would otherwise have to discover alone. Viewing this kind of investment through an abundance lens, as an accelerant rather than an expense, is itself one small, practical example of the entire mindset shift this topic keeps circling back to. None of this mindset work replaces actual financial education, and treating it as a substitute would be its own kind of mistake. The wealthy mindset consistently treats learning itself as an investment with returns. Reading, studying, seeking out mentors, understanding markets and systems well enough to make informed decisions rather than guesses. This learning rarely feels urgent in the moment, competing against the more immediate pull of entertainment or rest, which is exactly why so few people prioritize it consistently. But knowledge compounds the same way money does, each new piece of understanding making the next decision slightly sharper, slightly more confident, slightly less vulnerable to the exact traps that keep uninformed people stuck for decades without ever understanding why. Treating even a small amount of time each week as a fixed, non-negotiable investment in financial understanding produces a version of yourself years from now who simply sees more options than the version who never made that same commitment. Not because that future self is smarter, but because that future self has simply been paying closer attention for longer. This does not require formal education or expensive programs. A consistent habit of reading, listening, and asking questions accomplishes the same underlying goal, since the compounding effect comes from consistency far more than from the sophistication of any single source. The specific material studied matters far less than most people assume. What matters is the repeated act of engaging seriously with financial ideas, often enough that concepts which once felt foreign gradually become second nature, ready to be applied the moment a real decision actually requires them. A person who spends even 15 focused minutes a day on genuine financial learning accumulates, over a single year, more structured understanding than most people gain across an entire decade of passive exposure, simply because consistency, applied to learning, compounds in exactly the same quiet, invisible way it compounds inside an investment account, A useful test here is asking what the worst realistic outcome of an action actually looks like, rather than the worst imaginable one conjured by anxiety. Most calculated financial risks, examined honestly this way, turn out to carry a survivable downside and a genuinely meaningful upside. A combination the anxious mind rarely allows itself to see clearly, without deliberately slowing down to examine it. This willingness to sit with calculated risk connects directly to something worth naming plainly: the fact that discipline itself is a trainable capacity rather than a fixed personality trait some people simply possess, and others do not. Every small act of financial restraint, choosing to invest instead of spend, choosing to wait instead of react, strengthens the same underlying capacity the way a single repetition strengthens a muscle. Nobody starts with unlimited discipline, and expecting yourself to suddenly possess it, fully formed, before beginning, is one of the quieter reasons so many people never begin at all. Discipline gets built exactly the way it gets used, one repeated decision at a time, starting small enough to actually succeed, and growing stronger specifically because of that early, modest success, rather than in spite of it. A person who commits to investing a small, almost trivial amount consistently for 6 months builds far more real discipline than a person who commits to an ambitious, unsustainable plan abandoned within the first 2 weeks, because discipline is trained through completed repetitions, not through the size of the initial ambition. There is one more mindset shift worth naming directly, because it quietly underlies every other shift already covered here, and that is radical responsibility. It is far easier and far more emotionally comfortable to explain a stalled financial life through outside forces, an unfair economy, an unhelpful employer, circumstances that never gave a real chance to begin with. Some of these forces are genuinely real and genuinely unfair, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But wealth builders make a specific, deliberate choice regardless of how unfair the starting conditions actually were, choosing to focus entirely on the portion of the outcome still within their own control, rather than spending energy on the portion that is not. This is not about denying real obstacles. It is about refusing to let those obstacles become a permanent explanation for inaction, because a person waiting for the system to become fair before they start building will very often wait for the rest of their life. Two people can start from genuinely unequal circumstances, one with far greater disadvantages than the other, and still, years later, the one who focused relentlessly on their own controllable actions tends to outpace the one who spent that same time, however justifiably, focused on explaining why the outcome was never really possible for someone in their position. This is one of the hardest truths inside the entire mindset, uncomfortable precisely because it is true, and worth sitting with honestly rather than rushing past. Radical responsibility also extends into the smallest daily systems: the automatic transfer set up once and never touched, the recurring calendar reminder to review spending, the default choice made in advance so that willpower never has to be summoned fresh in a moment of temptation. Wealth builders tend to rely far less on motivation, which is famously unreliable, and far more on systems designed in a calm moment to carry the weight that motivation alone was never going to sustain through every difficult week ahead. Ultimately, every insight covered here means nothing without confronting the final, most uncomfortable gap of all: the space between knowing and doing. Most people already know they should spend less than they earn. Most people already suspect that investing beats saving in cash. Most people already sense that their current path will not lead where they actually want to go. Knowledge was never the missing piece for most stuck people; execution was. This gap survives precisely because execution requires tolerating uncertainty, discomfort, and the very real possibility of an early mistake. 3 things the human brain instinctively tries to avoid, even when avoiding them quietly guarantees a worse long-term outcome than the risk ever would have. The millionaire mindset is not simply a set of beliefs held quietly in the mind. It is those beliefs translated immediately and repeatedly into action, even when the action feels small, uncertain, or uncomfortable. A single small action taken today, however imperfect, moves someone further than a perfect plan endlessly refined but never actually started. Finally, understand this: wealth was never built by people who knew the most. It was built by people willing to act on what they knew, long before certainty ever arrived to make that action feel safe. Every mindset covered in this video was always available to you, quietly waiting underneath habits and beliefs that simply never got questioned until now. And the only real difference between where you stand today and where the wealthy mindset eventually leads is the decision to start applying even one of these shifts, starting with whichever one felt most uncomfortable to hear, since discomfort, as this entire video has shown, is usually the most reliable sign that something worth changing has finally been found. That single starting point, small and unremarkable as it may feel today, is exactly where every wealthy mindset in existence actually began.